So good evening, everybody. It's time to continue the discussions on foreign and security policy. In this panel, we will focus on regional security. We have a very fancy title, When the Baltic Sea Becomes a NATO Lake. So we will be talking about changes, of course, in European security and in our more immediate security environment. And at this very splendid evening here, we can't, of course, forget that there is a war going on in Europe, not so far from us. And it has had quite a strong impact already on security in the Baltic Sea region. A very concrete impact is that Finland and Sweden are on the way to become NATO members. So we will discuss what to expect from their NATO membership. Also we will discuss more broadly how countries in our region, Nordic-Baltic countries, see the future of our security. I think in one thing we are pretty much on the same page, that in this region we really understand that the outcome of the war in Ukraine will have really crucial meaning for our own security. So we are doing what we can to help Ukraine. So to make sense of all of it, I have a wonderful panel here with great experts. Jonatan Vseviov is Secretary General of the Estonian Foreign Ministry. Alan Ross is the Ambassador of the UK in Estonia. Jörgen Westerlund is from the Swedish Embassy Defense Attaché. Kusti Salm, Secretary General of the Ministry of Defense of Estonia. And Paavo Kotiaho from the Finnish Embassy. Unfortunately, the ambassador of Finland could not be with us, but we are very happy to have Paavo here to explain the Finnish views. And my name is Kristi Raik. I'm the director of the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute at the International Center for Defense and Security, and it's really my pleasure to moderate the discussion. And I want to thank, that I don't forget, the British Embassy for making this discussion possible, and also the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for all the organizational help. So let's get started. And to begin with, I mean, it's Friday evening. Let's not make it too deep and serious. I have a very simple question to all of you. When did you actually start to believe that Finland and Sweden will apply for NATO membership? Like what was the moment, and why? Why would you say so? To start with the Finnish view, Paavo.
Thank you very much, Kristi. First of all, thank you for inviting us also to this panel. It's a good way to spend a Friday evening. This question has been a cause of a lot of speculation. It's been asked of many Finns. I think every Finn, not only in these kind of settings, but in very many conversational settings. Our main decision makers have kind of gone around the question and not really said when. But to speak frankly, and of my own experience, I believe you could put a very clear date on the 25th of February of this year. I think there was a sense already before that, but if we start reinterpreting history now, we probably get a pretty messy picture. But my understanding is that what changed was the 24th, and from there on in, it seemed that we had no difficulty adjusting our views to the adjusted or the changed situation.
Yeah, the adjustment has indeed been amazing, and I have been personally amazed to see how many Finnish security policy makers and experts now say that, oh, I have for many years thought that Finland should join NATO. But Kusti, what about you?
Well, we were among the people who were thinking for many years that they should. Of course, we were apparently informed, at least until on the 25th of February. But for me personally, I think the moment of the clarity came somewhere in the mid-March, where we had exhausted most of the, let's say, high-level strategical levers of influencing Russia, like sanctions and condemning everyone and starting with weapons aid and all this. Then strategically, the next thing in the list seemed to be getting Finland and Sweden into NATO. And I think this is where the idea also surfaced in the wider Western media, and they started to take steam.
Jörgen, in Sweden it was slightly more difficult decision, it seems, than in Finland. But when did you kind of start to think that it's actually going to happen, the application?
Yeah, thank you very much. Nice to be here and talk about this topic. I can say that it was not in 1997 when I first participated in a NATO exercise that I could actually see that 2 decades later I could sit here and talk about Sweden joining NATO. But I think, as Finland said, and I think Sweden has also been following Finland a little bit in this, it was of course actually when it happened from the 24th of February. But I think in the mid-March, beginning of April, I start feeling that both the politician and the leadership of Sweden and media and the common people starting to turn. And I think we, in many cases, followed Finland into that. So let's say March, April, I got the feeling for it.
But Alan, you are not so closely involved in the region, but UK has been actually very keen supporter of the process. So when did you see that it's actually going to happen?
Also, thank you for having me, and it's great to be here. I think also around the same time, for me, it was looking at the opinion polling coming out of Finland and Sweden, because I think there had probably been support for it among the sort of political and security establishment maybe for some time, but you obviously have to have popular support for a big shift like that. So seeing the opinion polls change and having sort of 60-70% in favour of joining, you then thought, well, this seems like it's now inevitable that it's going to happen. And certainly for us as the UK, it's brilliant. It's great that Finland and Sweden are joining. We think it's fantastic. We've been partners for a long time, sort of through NATO, and done stuff with NATO partners, but also Finland and Sweden have been in the Joint Expeditionary Force for some time, which is sort of a UK-led initiative. And we think they're great partners for us to work with, and I think it's excellent news for everybody in this region.
Yeah, before I turn to Jonatan, I want to bring in one more specific moment from my point of view in this process, and that was the New Year's speech of the Finnish president, Sauli Niinistö, which actually made many people also in Estonia speculate about whether Finland is now about to pursue NATO membership. But certainly what was very clear was that the Finnish reaction to the proposals that Russia made in December was, I think, clearer and stronger than of almost any other country, that Finns really got it, that this is a very serious threat to our security policy. It kind of questions the fundamentals of our security policy. But Jonatan, how do you see the process? When did the Finns make up their mind?
So, well, first of all, thanks for having me as well. It's great to see good friends here. The problem with having 5 people, 5 like-minded people on a panel, is that you'll end up getting the same answer 5 times over and over again. Because my timeline is the same. It was roughly at around mid-March. I remember vividly a particular meeting when I yelled out, by next Wednesday, Finland and Sweden will be in, or will be applying. It obviously wasn't by next Wednesday, because these things take time. But that was roughly the moment when I felt it would happen. But I'll need to give you a bit of a background story on this, because it's really something that is vivid in my memory from the early days of the war. For years, at least we here in Estonia, certainly in the Estonian security policy community, have been working to achieve things in NATO that seem impossible. I remember back in the day we were talking about the importance of defense and deterrence. And even within NATO, you couldn't really use the word deterrence. It came across as too Cold War-y, too harsh. So we talked about assurance and reassurance and things like that. So we in Estonia, at least, are used to things changing and changing for the better. We are talking about deterrence and defense today, but usually this change takes place over a period of years and years. What happened on February 24th made these processes faster. Unspeakable things became discussion topics by the next day and done deals by the day after. These sanctions packages, the mother of all sanctions that had been coordinated amongst the big countries, the G7, the others, was rolled out immediately after the beginning of the war, and then we added a second round, a third round, a fourth round. How come? Well, there was no consensus yet before the war on the second round, the third round, the fourth round. And even smaller things, sanctioning certain particular individuals, for instance. Unspeakable on a Wednesday, a discussion topic by a Thursday, and a done deal by Friday. So that was the context in which I yelled out that the unspeakable, unthinkable, Finland and Sweden applying, would happen by next Wednesday. It didn't by next Wednesday, but it happened, especially in the early months of the war, as things were still sort of moving around. People were still wrapping their heads around what had happened. These things happened fast. The final thing, and I'll stop monopolizing the discussion then. I'm sure the questions will go that way, but it's not a done deal before it's a done deal. That too is an important point to be made. It's not a done deal until all NATO allies ratify the Washington Treaty.
Yes, of course. We'll get back to that later. But talking about big changes, and indeed there have been many of those in the past 6 months, and many analysts speak about a turning point in European security. We are at the moment where an era is about to end and a new one is about to start. We can't quite see yet what it is going to look like. But Jonatan, what are your expectations for this new era? This is a very big question, of course, but what is going to be different?
Everything will be different. Everything. The Ukraine that went into this war is different Ukraine than the Ukraine that comes out of it. The Russia that went in is going to be a different Russia from the Russia that emerges from it. The European Union will be different from the European Union that went into it. NATO will be different. I mean, we're already different. Ukraine is already different. But once this war stops or is ended, things will change that will be fundamental in nature. And not just the players on our continent, perhaps on this planet, but also the rules by which the game is being played. These core principles of European security, all of which have come now under attack, they will either be strengthened or they will be destroyed. Destroyed, and I'm not using this word easily. Furthermore, this war, the way we behave in the context of this war, will define us as the West. I mean, we talk the talk of the rules-based world order, rule of law, democracy, but primarily the rules-based world order that we have built and are keen on defending. Well, this here is the test. It will define us in the eyes of the world, but also it will define us internally. The way we behave, whether we succeed, whether we fail, this will define us. So the short answer is everything will change. Every single thing will change, and that's why it's so naive and short-sighted to hope to somehow brush this thing under a rug or a carpet. Let's make a deal of some sort before, short of winning. Let's just forget about it. Well, we can, but then we'll lose everything else.
Yeah, this notion that you mentioned, rules-based international order, it's something we have been talking about over quite a few years, about how it is in danger and it's undermined. And of course, Crimea was already a very clear sign. Borders were changed in Europe by military force. This had not happened previously. after actually the Second World War. But still, I think now we actually realize what it can mean when this order does break down. That what it brings about is war. So now we are actually serious about it. It's no longer just rhetoric. But one organization, of course, that has been forced to very rapidly adjust is NATO. And there was this very important NATO summit in Madrid this summer. Kusti, you have said in public that Estonia got almost everything it expected from the summit, right? The decisions were really really significant. There was the new strategic concept approved. There was the decision to increase NATO presence on the eastern flank and build up the rapid reaction capacity. But these decisions are yet to be implemented. So what can you tell us about the implementation? How quickly is it actually going to happen? Can something still go wrong?
Well, yes. The summit in Madrid, it was a grandiose event, clearly. And even at the time of war, we all need to take a moment to celebrate. And clearly what happened in Madrid, we just agreed on a piece of paper. Grandiose words, guidance given by all the presidents and prime ministers. That was crucial for us, and this is the key moment we want to bring out, and that is something that actually changed. And this was the deterrence model. The NATO agreed that the tripwire deterrence model is obsolete, and we need to turn to deterrence by denial. It basically means that you need to be ready from the first second, so Russians wouldn't even have a thought of, trying to invade Estonia. This was the big guidance shift, and it was a big one because we had all these discussions with all the allies, and they needed convincing in this. Because this tripwire thing also made a lot of sense, because we were advocated for this 5 to 7 years ago. But clearly this paragraph that says that we will shift into this doesn't really create this deterrence. So what we need to do, we need to make sure that the NATO's command and control structures, all the colonels and brigadiers and everyone will be in place doing their job, making sure that their actual troops who are going to fulfill this promise, they're actually allocated, they actually exist, they have actual training, they have actual weapons. We have actually pre-positioned ammunition. And on top of all this, and this is a lot of stuff, tens of thousands of soldiers need to do a lot of work for this, and people like me. But on top of all this, the face value of this will be revealed by what Russians think of this. It all will be useless if they don't believe that we are actually going to move from the first second. And I think this is the biggest challenge. We actually need to shift that the NATO's resolve is also believable for Russians, and our stance and our commitment into actually defending the values and territories and everything that we stand for.
Yeah, now I turn to the UK perspective. The UK has been such an important ally, of course, present here in Estonia, and already before the summit, the UK increased its presence here to 1,700 troops it is now, right? And also, you have been very active in supporting the Finnish and Swedish NATO path. It was significant that the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, he actually visited Finland and Sweden a few days before they submitted the application to NATO. And they agreed on a declaration that basically offers security guarantees to Finland and Sweden, which, the two countries have been a bit concerned about this interim period when they have submitted applications, but they are not yet members. So I don't think any NATO country actually went quite as far in offering security guarantees. So why is it so important for the UK?
Thank you very much. So first of all on that, there's a sort of prosaic explanation and then a sort of deeper explanation. So the prosaic one is that when we left the EU, we no longer had the sort of common defence guarantee that we would have had with Finland and Sweden as fellow members of the EU. So in a way, we were replacing something that had been taken away because of our departure from the EU. That's a very dry explanation. Like the underlying reason we, Prime Minister Johnson went there and did that was we wanted our allies to feel that sense of reassurance and have him visit in person and know that we would, be there with them. So it's a really genuine feeling behind it, but also it was replacing something that had gone. I think you always enjoy these panels when people disagree slightly. It's more fun if they disagree. So I'm going to pick up something that Kusti said around the tripwire thing, which is just some of our troops are at the back of the arena here, watching, and I know from talking to previous battle groups who've been here that we never liked the idea that they were a tripwire. It's very difficult to turn around to some of our soldiers and say you're a tripwire, and we've never had that view. And actually the EFP, which is here, the one that's set up in Estonia, is set up slightly differently to the other EFPs in the region. So it's a very minor thing, but I know you always prefer it if people don't just vigorously agree with each other. But the fundamental point that Kusti made is completely true, and we completely agree in terms of strengthening our presence here and our capabilities and having much more deterrent effect. I think our view is we were always ready to defend every inch of Estonia from day one, but it's just that we'll be more capable of doing so in the future because we'll have a stronger presence here. It sometimes upsets some of my military colleagues if they hear themselves described as a tripwire, because when you start thinking what that means, it's not actually a particularly good concept if you're one of the soldiers who's here.
Sure, yeah, you actually got the debate going, so Jonatan wanted to react.
No, I just wanted to briefly say, Mr. Ambassador, you're a country that has more troops in Estonia than almost anybody except for one country, that's us. And you said you don't like the tripwire concept, and I agree. We're perhaps the ones who like it even less. You don't want to be a tripwire? Well, you know what? We don't want to be a tripwire. We don't want to be a tripwire. Not a single Estonian soldier wants to be a tripwire, and that's why we had to convince everybody so hard to get rid of the tripwire concept. And what Kusti was saying is not really disagreeing with you. What we now need to do is make sure we implement the Madrid decisions. Because frankly, however bad it feels for EFP soldiers, I assure you, it feels 100 times worse for us because we actually live here.
Let me now turn to the Finnish and Swedish views again. I mean, you are not yet in NATO, but for sure you have been thinking a lot about what kind of NATO members you will be when you join, and what kind of NATO you wish to see then. But my question maybe to Paavo first. So, how will NATO membership, assuming it will actually happen, and we all believe it will, how will it change the Finnish security and defense policy?
Thank you, Kristi. I think you may have asked that question because you kind of had in mind what I wanted to say in this matter. There is a lot of talk about change, and for very good reasons. But I also maybe wanted to point to a couple of points of continuity, especially in Finnish security policy thinking. And these are messages my ambassador wanted me to convey today. The mic closer. Thank you very much for that point. Goes without saying that there will be a number of changes, but goes without saying at the same time, for those of us at least who have been following security policy, that this is not something that came as that much as a surprise, even if it might to some seem as unthinkable or unspeakable at the time. If we go back even further than the last 30 years, looking at the 1940s and the years that followed thereafter, there was a time where we had to take specific measures after the Second World War because Finland was under very large duress. But if you look at then the couple of decades thereafter, there was no question in Finnish security policy thinking where the threat was coming from. If you look at our military posture at the time, it was evident that it was the Soviet Union that was the threat that we were preparing for. And if we look at the way in which Finland consistently then prepared for that, and then continues to prepare that, and that also still now is a cornerstone in our national defense thinking. I'm talking now about our national defense capabilities. We can see that there is a sort of kind of continuity which is going to continue even when the membership process hopefully then gets finished. So that's the first point. Then if we look at Finland's relationship with NATO, 94 with the Partnership for Peace, enhanced opportunities partnership. There is a level of interoperability which we already have in that sense. So if we ask the generals, for example, who very thankfully already know each other across the Gulf of Finland, for example, and in many other countries, in that sense, I believe that they would say that we're pretty much ready in many senses. Then there's a lot to learn at the same time as well. That maybe goes more to the kind of jobs that I myself do and colleagues in different places in Brussels and so forth. And at this time, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the ministries represented here in Estonia for their invaluable assistance and guidance throughout the year. It's been honestly very helpful in that way. So to come to the answer to your question directly, what will change in the Finnish national defense? The cornerstones that Finland will still rely on its own developed national defense capabilities, that won't change. But if before we were thinking that in the case, for example, of a crisis in the Baltic Sea region, we'll be working in parallel with NATO, once we are full members of the alliance, we'll be working together with NATO in that regard. So I believe that would be one of the bigger changes. And should you want me to go further, I'll be more than happy to elaborate.
Yeah, thanks. This was pretty detailed. Thank you. And the point to increase continuity, that is indeed important. And actually, NATO has not had such continuity, of course, when it comes to the Russian threat. We remember the post-Cold War era when most of Europe thought that Europe was actually not facing a military threat and that territorial defense was something quite outdated, and many countries kind of reoriented their military capability, their armies to expeditions somewhere far away. But Finland and Sweden were among the few countries in Europe that maintained general conscription, that maintained this thinking that actually territorial defense is needed, and we can't be sure that there won't be a threat from our eastern neighbor. So how about Sweden then? What does Sweden think now about how does NATO membership change your security and defense policy?
Without repeating everything that Paavo said, but I think we have sort of a same history or background, even though the proximity to Russia is a bit far away. So we can have a bit of a standoff. So from that point of view, I think it's always been clear that our potential enemy, of course, has always been Russia. We have the same system, and I think in the future now, since we're not members yet, we have a lot of adaptation to look forward to before becoming a full member of NATO. And with that coming, I think Sweden and Finland will take, I think, a great responsibility in the northern part of Europe and in the Baltic Sea region. We have together quite big and strong capabilities, mostly I think in the air and the sea. So I think the Baltic Sea region will be the main focus for us, and perhaps do this then in a bigger way together with NATO, because more of a cliche perhaps, but NATO gets stronger with Finland and Sweden, and Finland and Sweden will be much stronger together with NATO. So I think that's the common thing. So we're looking bright for the future and to be full members.
Thank you. Kusti, what do you expect from Finland and Sweden as NATO members?
Well, I will be the one who is cooling down the enthusiasm now a little bit. It's all good news, don't get me wrong. It's, you know, we have all waited for this and it's awesome. Great, we snapped it in the parliament and everything. But it's, you know, hardly unlikely that there were policymakers in Stockholm and Helsinki observing the Ukraine war and thought that, you know, NATO has a defense posture problem and we need to go out for rescue. It was, I think, rather other way around. And also, if we look at it from our side, then it's well, clearly not having Finland or Sweden in NATO isn't our biggest security problem. Our largest security problem is the immense force overmatch in our region, the lack of strategic depth that well, we have and Russians don't. The reinforcement problem, well, clearly that is sort of illustrated in Suwalki Gap area. The very easy tactical ways of grading the anti-access air denial and all this. This is our issue. And unfortunately, well, Finnish and Swedish succession clearly doesn't make it worse, but it really doesn't make it any better either. We still need to be committed into getting the NATO's force posture better in our region, the decision-making procedures better, and all this that we talked about earlier. And also the other element, I think, that is often sort of overlooked, that, well, although many might have the impression that Russians are stupid, but they are not that stupid. And in their military planning, they didn't think that Finland and Sweden will stay idle when there will be sort of the Third World War in Europe. So they were already taking into account that they will be involved. So nominally, when we think of the Northern Eastern Europe, then there isn't any security that comes on top of the pre-24 February situation. There won't be more weapons because of the accession of Finland and Sweden. There won't be more soldiers. It's the same. Okay, the collective defense decision-making format makes it better, makes it more integrated and all this. But as our Finnish and Swedish friends said, well, we have been pretty integrated already, to be honest. But otherwise, it's all good news.
Thank you for bringing some realism to the discussion. I want to ask Alan about defense cooperation in Northern Europe, because this is also something that has been a priority of the UK. You have been actually active in promoting defense cooperation. Does that change in any way now? There's this JEF formation where the countries in the region have all been participating already. What will happen to that in future?
So a brief explainer for people who are wondering who JEF is. JEF is a thing and not a person. So it's the Joint Expeditionary Force, and it's 8 Nordic and Baltic countries, the UK and the Netherlands. It's existed for some time. The UK was sort of behind its creation. My view is that it has just as much value in the future once Finland and Sweden are members of NATO as it did when they weren't. It was a useful thing in the past in a way of bringing in our allies and working together with non-NATO allies. But again, as others on the panel have said, they were very sort of close partners anyway. But the value of the JEF is, I think, it's much more nimble, much more agile, can respond potentially to sort of more quickly and potentially sort of lower level threats. And its decision making is much more straightforward. So basically the way it works, if the UK and at least one of the other countries in the JEF are doing an operation together, that's sort of badged as JEF, and we just go ahead and do it, and none of the others can block that. There's no sort of, we don't have to sit around and reach a consensus. So I think that's just as useful in the future, even when all of the JEF countries are also NATO members. But I mean, I'm interested to hear what the others think, but I think just as valuable in the future and still has a really important role.
Yeah, so we are talking about change, but we are also talking about continuity, and you can kind of argue both ways that with Finnish and Swedish NATO membership, it's a huge change, but at the same time, it's a lot of continuity in there. Jonatan, what is your view, and maybe also more from a kind of foreign policy, diplomacy point of view, what changes in the Nordic-Baltic cooperation?
Well, it's a huge change, and then it's not at the same time. So both are true. It's a major strategic change, no question about it. As Kusti said, something that we've been waiting for quite some time. This said, it's not a done deal. We're talking about this as if it were a done deal. Oh, once it happens and so on and so forth. Well, all 30 need to say yes. And their parliaments need to ratify it. All 30 have said yes, but not all 30 parliaments have ratified it. And we are doing our best to help Finland and Sweden get all 30 to say yes. But it's just an important point to underline because I was in one of those 30 capitals not too long ago. And they really don't like a number of things. One of the things they don't like is them being taken for granted. So we need to get them to say yes. Once this happens, Finland and Sweden come into NATO. It's a great thing for the region. It's a great thing for Finland and Sweden, and it's a great thing for NATO. It's a huge change, but that change needs to be filled with substance. So what is NATO? I mean, it's easy to talk about NATO, sit here at this panel. I mean, it's Article 5, the three musketeers, all for one, one for all. Yes, that's all very important. But there is substance in it as well. The substance doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't. We remember, we joined in 2004. We had no idea how NATO works before 2006, 7, Kusti might disagree, 8. It takes time. It takes time for you to actually integrate yourself, no matter how interoperable your armed forces are. No matter how interoperable your armed forces are, it takes time. NATO, what is the NATO command structure and the force structure? These command and control issues are not military technical issues. They are an important element of not only our defense, but also of our deterrence. All of this now needs to be figured out to make sure that we actually don't just add Finland and Sweden and the capabilities that Finland and Sweden had yesterday to NATO, but that we make sure that 1 + 1 is more than 2. It's doable. It has to be done. I mean, that's the only value out of the whole thing, but it's not going to happen automatically. Sub-regional or regional cooperation within NATO. So what NATO does, it gives you a framework, and then you go deeper. Our cooperation, military cooperation with the United Kingdom is deeper than our cooperation is with some other allies. Not because we like them less, but it just so happens the UK is the framework nation here. I mean, we cooperate. We plan together, we exercise together, we do things we don't do necessarily with other allies. And it goes without saying that for us to have a regional strengthening of the alliance, we need to get to that point with Finland and Sweden, not just between Finland and Sweden, but between Finland and Sweden and all the other NATO allies in the region, so that our defense forces knew Finnish defense plans as well as they know Latvian defense plans and vice versa, so that we would constantly exercise and plan, not only at the minimum level that you're expected to plan and exercise once you're in NATO, to maintain interoperability, but so that we could conduct what, for the lack of better words, I would call regional defense. Regional defense, not just NATO defense. We do NATO defense anyways. We're a nuclear alliance, so we're pretty good at it. But we need to get to a regional defense. That was not a diplomatic talking point. But you know, actually, we diplomats, we're not only talking about substanceless, substanceless stuff. Sometimes the things that we say actually mean things. And I think this NATO business is more than just arranging talking points, but getting stuff done so that they would actually deter and secure our region.
I think it was Kusti who said it before that Russia has known anyway that if a war happens in this region, Finland and Sweden won't just stand by. But at the same time, we have not known quite exactly what they would do. So this is something that I expect will change, that there will be much more concrete plans so that we know what Finland and Sweden will do and what we will do together. So how is this defense planning process going to look like? When do you get to making these plans of Finnish and Swedish contribution?
Yeah, that plan is, I think it's a bit tricky because I'm not really fully involved in it, but I can at least say that we have a long way to go. And I think one of the parts, and I totally agree with Jonatan, I think at least in Sweden and perhaps even in Finland, we need to have a big change of mind change. I mean, we've been planning our national defense for hundreds of years to be alone, perhaps together with Finland in modern time when we have this common operational planning. But we need to get a step further to do that together with NATO. And whole NATO, as you said, all about how do we do this defense planning together. We in Sweden, at least, we have done it ourselves, and we have perhaps thought about getting support from somebody else, but we hasn't been sure about it. That's one of the reasons we're joining NATO, that then we can at least have some assurance of having this support. But I think we have a very long step to go, and it will take some time. Military-wise, the armed forces, I think both in Sweden and Finland, perhaps not really as easy as just connect and start cooperation. We've been doing exercises, international operations together for many, many years. So I think that's perhaps the easiest part, but all this planning and do it together, the shift from having, I don't know, hundreds of wartime planners back home in the HQ in Sweden. We don't need that perhaps in the same amount. We need to do it together with all the partners and allies in the future. So I think that's a big mind change that needs to be done.
Yes, Paavo, I think the same issue is very much valid also for Finland, this mindset of collective defense. But in addition, it's been very frequently raised question in the Finnish NATO debates over the past years that, oh, does Finland then have to take responsibility for defending the Baltic states? Right? And it has been really a bit weird discussion, kind of not quite adequately reflecting how NATO works as a collective defense alliance. Somehow this assumption has been there, at least between the lines, that then it will be Finland taking care of defending the Baltic states. But where is this debate now, and what is Finland actually going to contribute?
Thank you very much. I don't know how it is with the other panelists, but sometimes there is a very serious disjoint on the public debate on certain questions related to international affairs, and then the actual working of international affairs, where the things are pushing forward. Before I answer this question, I just want to perhaps touch on the point that Secretary General Vseviov mentioned earlier regarding it not being a done deal. I think it's really important to say out loud that we are taking with the utmost seriousness and severity all concerns of all allies in this process. And you're absolutely correct in saying that not one ally nor their concerns ought to be taken for granted. And I believe that's also the line of Finland and our highest decision makers. And there will be work to be done. And there have been agreements which have been made which need to be respected and will be respected on Finland's side. And in that regard, we're not treating this matter as a done deal, even if Finnish security policy Twitter might be dealing with that issue in that manner. So I think it's just important to say that outright. In terms of then this question about Finland taking responsibility, here again, I'd like to perhaps revert back to what was said earlier. We do not yet have the experience or knowledge of the way in which NATO works in all its details and all its defense planning and so on. This is a question which has been brought up, and the answer thus far that Finland has been able to give is that when we seek membership and the commitments that we have made thus far, they, in a sense, do not go any more beyond the details to saying that Finland will be a good member of the alliance and committed to the foundational principles, including collective security. The details which happened afterwards are those which we will then work as members of the alliance if this deal then gets made at some point in the near or further future. But those details are best left for that point of time, and speculation on the matter will not aid the process, nor, I would believe, the functioning of the alliance. Thanks.
So this issue of ratification process has been coming up so many times, and of course I was planning to ask about it anyway, so let's take a bit closer look at that. I mean, on the one hand, we have seen countries competing with each other in NATO as to who is the fastest to ratify, and it all looks very good when it comes to alliance cohesion. But then there is a number of countries that have not ratified yet, and we do expect Turkey to actually possibly prolong the process, and Turkey is tying this issue to its own security concerns that perhaps Turkey feels NATO has not been taking seriously enough. So how is NATO dealing with this issue? How to smooth the tensions there and make sure it all goes in the right direction, Jonatan?
Well, I wouldn't call them tensions. This is to be expected. I mean, the Washington Treaty is a pretty basic document. You can go online, you can read it. Even Article 5, the famous Article 5. The text of it is, I mean, it's elegantly written, but it's not the Magna Charta. I mean, it's relatively short. The substance comes from how we behave and act every single day as allies. And yes, this Article 5 is ironclad talking point. It means something. Now, it's also true that we have 30 allies now with the various, security concerns. We would argue that Russia unites us in many ways as a security concern, but geography is still king. Where you sit, where you stand depends on where you sit. You can't change your borders. You can't change your location. And those that are further to the south are more threatened by certain scenarios than those situated more to the north. Yet by signing and ratifying this treaty, what you basically say is that in face of the worst imaginable dangers, you as a sovereign country promise solemnly to send not only your troops, but sacrifice your economy and your population's safety, not for the sake of the security concern that affects you, but for the security concern that affects the other country. You take an oath. And by the way, it's not just a polite thing to do. The whole thing comes crushing down for all of us the first moment somebody serious doubts in this. So these are not tensions. Everybody needs to be absolutely comfortable with this notion of additional members joining. We were poked as we were negotiating our way into NATO. Once in, you promise to defend the other one, even if the danger against which you promise to defend them does not affect you. And in military strategic terms, this is as big a deal as it gets. So my personal prediction is that it's going to be fine. All 30 countries will ratify. All 30 will need to make sure that their security concerns are as addressed as everybody else's. We in Estonia were so confident of this because we know Finland and Sweden so well. We have such lengthy history living next to Finland and Sweden. We've cooperated so intensively that we were certain. That's why we were able to ratify this fast. It wasn't a race to create a good tweet. It was because we know Finland and Sweden as well as we do. All 30 need to. And there's nothing, almost nothing, that other NATO allies can do to smooth the way. There was this talk that, maybe the Americans, maybe the Brits, maybe the big guys, maybe the small guys like Estonia, maybe we can do something. No, we can't. It is a matter that is between those trying to come in and those who are in. And this said, again, I think it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. It might be, slightly lengthier than what the biggest optimists expected, but at the end of the day, I'm sure it's going to be fine.
I have to ask also for the Swedish view on this. I mean, did it come as a surprise to Sweden that it happened like this with the Turkish support, and how do you see the way forward?
Yeah, I think so. At least I was a bit surprised because I didn't even think about it, because a couple of months ago we didn't have this discussion about joining. So when it actually occurred, it was like, okay, that's a bump in the road. But I agree. It's a long process. It needs to take its time, and it's up to every country. If other countries can support, in this case, Finland and Sweden, fine. But yeah, and of course, all the reasons that I have seen in media, they can differ. I mean, there's a lot of other member countries that also had some initial issues, but I think has been sorted out. So yes, it was a bit surprising, but I think that's the way it is, and the way ahead is up to every nation and membership states anyway. So I would be a bit surprised, yeah.
Thank you. Now we have the audience listening to us carefully. I haven't forgotten about you. Would you have questions to the panelists? Let's take the first the first round of questions at this point. Before I go on with my list of questions, I see one hand up, I think. More than one, 3. Okay, somebody has a mic, I suppose, to go around? No? Or you just have to shout?
Maybe I can have one thought in between. I just started to think on the fact when did we in Estonia started really to feel like actual members of NATO. And I remember a funny thing that when I came to work into Ministry of Defense, it was in 2007, then we had this funny thing that in every paper we wrote, and believe me, we write a lot of papers there. Usually in the first paragraph, we put in a sentence saying that we as a full-fledged member of NATO, and whatever, we found a place to put this sentence in. Not that we are a member of NATO, but we are full-fledged, täieõiguslik liige. And it went on until 12, 13, and then it suddenly disappeared. And it actually disappeared after the Crimea, where we first sat on the table and actually steered the NATO's policy. And I think this was 10 years after actually accessing the alliance, when we really thought that, you know, we now get what this allied defense means. And in this case, in Madrid, well, these were our, you know, little tender fingers of our, you know, defense officials, diplomats, and maybe not so tender fingers of soldiers who wrote this forward defense concept and all this. And I think this is where we, well, now we really feel that we are part of, and that's what is 18 years after?
Yeah, the position of Estonia in the alliance certainly looks more influential today, I would say. But let's now turn to the questions. There was one in the back that I saw first. Oh, the microphone is in the front. Okay, let's start in the front.
Thank you so much.
Please introduce yourself shortly.
Valeria Jägisman, a citizen, an Estonian citizen. So I would like to ask Kusti, but also everyone else, would you elaborate on the shortcomings of NATO against Russia? And yeah, I wanted to touch on Russia. It's kind of an elephant in the room. Do you think that Russia may, maybe not now, attack NATO? And will NATO be able to defend its members and to do it effectively? Thank you.
So, a small question to you.
Yeah, from a citizen, that was the right audience. Well, clearly the answer is yes. Of course, NATO is capable, we are ready, and all this is right. But the actual truth is more nuanced. If we speak about threat, then it's never a binary thing, that there is threat, no threat. There is no such on-off button somewhere. It's a sort of a likelihood thing. And if we speak about threat perception and the likelihood, that it's very different for people. What is the likelihood of dying into the vaccination of COVID? 1 in 4 million? Something like this? Yet there are millions of people around the world who is afraid of this. What is the likelihood of dying from the air accident? 1 in, I don't know, 100 million, something, whatever. Very, very high. There are still a lot of people who are afraid of going into airplane. Now if we speak about even a theoretical chance of military conflict in, well, for example, one NATO member, Estonia, then we can come up with, well, limited amount of scenarios where this becomes very likely. And although we cannot never attribute a concrete number of percentage there, then this is clearly, well, higher than 1%. Well, this is where our threat perception actually goes into red. We need to make sure that it isn't 1%, that it's significantly less, and all the potential solutions are ruled out for any miscalculation from Russian side and all this. And that's why we are speaking about these policy changes, deterrences, command structures, troops, ammunitions, and all this. It needs to be a sort of a 360 degrees picture that actually assures this. And eventually, you know, we work in Ministry of Defense. We provide a public service. So it's not a thing in itself. And the public service we are providing isn't, you know, buying weapons. The public service is That is for you to safely live here, for you to buy, I don't know, an apartment, because you know that for the next 40 years when you pay back your loan, it's safe here. For you to, run your own business, knowing that it's safe to be here. And that is the actual sort of safety. And these standards there are much higher than they are, for example, in Russia, where they can afford, GDP decline of 20% in 2 quarters. Well, we cannot clearly afford this.
Thank you. Let's take more questions. If you move the mic to the back. Yes.
Hi, my name is Brit, and I have a question. As I understand, also in the Article 5, there is a point or something that says that in case of Russian, not only Russian, but in any aggression, a NATO country must endure like a certain amount of days until, the NATO forces can come to help or something like that. And my other question is, do you feel that the NATO has done enough to strengthen the eastern flank? We talked in the beginning that the UK soldiers, by the way, thank you for your service, that they are like a tripwire. But until we have the necessary firepower and manpower here, it seems like the Baltic states, it feels like at least, is the tripwire. So how does it look to you, and how do you see? Is it even possible to achieve this kind of strength? And of course, the first question: how long do we have to endure?
Also, the previous questions, I think they're linked. You asked, the first part of your question was around sort of what are the shortcomings in NATO, and I'm not going to do a long list or anything like that, but the really obvious one that we've all mentioned is there are 30 countries in it, and it takes potentially longer to get 30 countries to agree to do anything than it would do if you were just one. What we need to do is relentlessly focus on how to do things as quickly as possible. So our defence minister in the UK, Ben, wants to talk about us operating at the speed of relevance. So we might have had in the past models where we say, right, we can provide a certain amount of reinforcement in 60 days or 90 days or 180 days or something. And in his view, that's no good. We need to be able to operate a lot faster. So a shortcoming is sort of complexity, and we need to tackle that by being able to operate very, very quickly. And maybe let one of the other panelists answer the second question. But I would simply say, I mean, the decisions that we made in Madrid, we've now allocated as the UK a brigade, which is sort of 4,500 troops, who would be earmarked, and we would be able to say specifically at any time which brigade would come here, and we would have forward deployed elements of a brigade headquarters, and we will have the enhanced forward presence battle group, some of whom are here, but with strength and capabilities already here. And there's also, again, it links to sort of both questions, and Kusti's point about the nature of the threat. There's a big spectrum of threats between a very limited, small-scale incursion and then a sort of Russia massing its entire armed forces on the border. And as I think all of you will have seen, when Russia was put lots of its troops and equipment on the Ukrainian border, we all saw that. There were lots of warnings, and they were there for months, and it was obvious what they were about to do. So the bigger the nature of the threat, the more likely it is we'd get more warning of that, and we would be able to reinforce quickly and have more troops here. But with what we have earmarked and with what we have here, we should be able to deal with a sort of a lower level threat or a lower level incursion. So it's about being able to quickly match the response to the nature of the threat. So that's a slightly geeky answer, but I think that's my best attempt to answer it.
Yeah, just to add something, I think at least my Supreme Commander back home in Sweden talked about threshold effect. And I think one of the ways now, the last couple of years, we have increased the defense spending quite a lot, and we have a goal to reach 2% as well. But you don't always talk about the quantity of the amount of troops that we have, but we talk about the readiness of the troops, how well trained they are the equipment and technology relevant. So the higher those are, the higher the threshold for actually be able to meet the threat. I think that's also part of it.
There was a third hand, yes, back there.
Thank you. My name is Yuli. I'm a Ukrainian citizen, and I was scrolling at Twitter during this discussion, and I've seen one drunk Russian official Dmitry Medvedev posting a threat saying that European Union nuclear plants might have also experienced accidents, meaning, basically a threat. So it makes me think like how far NATO is prepared to act on a hybrid threat like that, which is uncommon and not completely like, a tank breaking a border, but there's something, just how far is it, how can you reassure us, citizens and people living here, that NATO is ready to deter and actually ready to act on such a hybrid threats? Thank you.
If I may add to that, this broader issue of nuclear threat, which Russia has been using, misusing during this war in really outrageous ways, and has managed to create quite a lot of fear in Western societies. So how should NATO deal with something like that?
That's a very big question. Well, first of all, I can't come. What's the English term for interneti troll? Kuidas see on? Kõik saavad eesti keelest aru, ju? Troll, no kuidas on trollivad internetis? Troll. That's what it is? Okay. Well, there you go. So it's just, to paraphrase a former president of the United States, it's just sad that a major global nuclear power has to use its former president as an internet troll these days. Because that's how they're using him. He was trolling us a few days ago, using Dzerzhinsky's, and you all know who Dzerzhinsky is, quotes. So I wouldn't pay too much attention to all of this. This is done on purpose. This is done on purpose, yes, partly to confuse us, but primarily to scare us. To scare us into believing that they are irrational, that they might escalate into the nuclear domain, and so on and so forth. Now, all of this stuff, as Kristi correctly said, is outrageous, in many cases dangerous and vulgar. But we need to keep in mind that it is not an accident that they're doing it. There is a purpose behind this. And the purpose is to scare us into paralysis, so that we would be so paralyzed by fear that we would cease to support Ukraine and conduct the policies that we have chosen, the policy of increasing the cost of aggression and so on and so forth. So what is to be done at the macro level is very important not to be afraid. I mean, all of this stuff is very, very serious. But it is very important for us to remember that we are serious people too. As the French foreign minister, I think now former foreign minister, very shortly said, didn't elaborate on this, just said, NATO is a nuclear alliance as well. We don't troll, our officials don't troll people on Twitter. We don't throw these threats around because we're confident. We don't need to scare anybody into paralysis. We have other tools. We have sanctions, and we are very confident in our ability to defend ourselves. There's a previous question on Article 5. I think you should all go online and read Article 5. It is a very elegantly written text. Basically says what the Three Musketeers said. An attack on one is to be considered an attack on all. And then it goes on and into a bit more specifics, but it doesn't lay out military plans. Military plans are laid out in military plans. That's why we need to actually do the work to fill NATO with substance, and we have been doing it. NATO has been doing it since 1949. We in Estonia have been doing it as a NATO ally since 2004, and Finland and Sweden, once they're in, will do it then. We are absolutely confident in NATO's ability to win any war. Any war. That's not the question. The question is, how do you avoid a miscalculation of such grave, catastrophic proportions in the first place? A major war between NATO and another nuclear power would be a very short one. We would win, but we wouldn't like that victory. It has to be avoided at all costs. The way to avoid it is through building a credible deterrence posture. That's why the nerdy stuff that the ambassador was talking about is so important. It just doesn't happen automatically. We have to build it We have to build it, and then we have to communicate it with the command structure, with the exercises, with allied troops present here, and so on and so forth. How well a job have we done? We've done an outstanding job. But that is no guarantee that tomorrow will go as yesterday did. So it's hard work, hard work.
Bravo, you want to...
Thank you. There's been a thought that's been in my mind which has a little bit been troubling me, and I tried to kind of put my finger on it, and I think I've gotten somewhere close. We've talked about what NATO does. What are NATO's shortcomings? What would NATO do? And I've been trying to think what NATO is. And I'm an international lawyer by training, come diplomat in a later part of my life. So the answer I'm coming to is that there really is not a specific abstract entity called NATO somewhere floating about which does things. If we look at the international agreements in itself, we quickly realize that the question is about a system of relationships and commitments between sovereign nations, those sovereign nations being represented by actual people. So to simplify, it's a question about how we promise to each other to behave in different kind of situations which are defined in treaties, but in this kind of situation we talk about the most extreme kind of adversities. I'm bringing this up because this is not the only set of promises that these same actors make to each other. It is not the only place where topics which are relevant to these questions have been dealt with. When we're talking about international nuclear security, it's a question which goes beyond this debate which is being constructed slightly between NATO and Russia. It's the interest of the entire global community. There are steadfast rules on which we have built these energy systems, which need to be respected by everybody. And every single member of the international community has an interest in their upholding in that sense as well. So that is the first point. Coming to hybrid threats, for example, this also very much holds true, not only NATO, in our region, the European Union, but elsewhere as well. These are questions which need to be considered, and action has been taken. One of the silver linings, I believe, of this year, which we've been able to point to at some points, is the speed at which many of those countries which see eye to eye have been able to make decisions to counter the adversity and the attack by Russia to Ukraine. I'm just hoping that that similar resolve can then also be witnessed in other areas of international affairs. And here again, I'm saying international affairs not in the abstract sense, but in the way in which we make promises to each other, and as Secretary General has said, in the way in which we act towards each other. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I want to dig a bit more on this Russian perspective and pose you a question that I personally find very annoying, but because I have been getting it so frequently in discussions among say, European Western security policy experts, it's something we all need to be ready to answer. And it is about this argument that NATO has been provoking Russia by enlarging first to the Baltic states, and now you may even make the same claim about Finland and Sweden, that somehow NATO is to blame for Russia being so aggressive. Of course, in Estonia, you hardly find anyone who would kind of subscribe to this claim, but this debate keeps going on among very serious professional security experts. So what is your reply? Who wants to start? Kusti?
Well, clearly they cannot be very serious security experts when they're making this claim, because it's, in substance, it's nonsensical. Well, first of all, because NATO members, including Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and all the others, are sovereign nations. We do our own decisions, and we are not some sort of puppets of some other countries. That's one thing. That is clearly the mindset question. And nominally speaking, NATO troops, okay, they are a little bit more now, but EFP was 800 soldiers. 800, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, together a little bit more than 2,000. 200,000 troops under arms, regulars, in NATO in Western Military District only. And we can go with all the howitzers, fighter aircrafts, anything, force overmatch is by the factor of 100 in most of the cases. So it's ridiculous, it's stupid, it's everything it is. But at the same time, it also showcases that how successful the Russian propaganda is, how successful their narrative setting is and all this, and how easily we get attracted to these narratives, which at the same time means that well, how less acquainted we are with these actual serious security topics. So we need to do quick homeworks very fast.
I agree with that entirely, and I find one other thing that's quite useful is just basically quoting senior Russians back at people. So they can make this claim all they like about it was all about NATO expansion, etc. But when they are making speeches or writing articles or having them ghostwritten for them, but articles saying Ukraine doesn't exist and we're going to recreate the Soviet Union or Peter the Great's empire. I mean, it's obvious what they're thinking about because they keep telling us. So that's one point, is to just keep quoting their own words sort of back at them. I also think it's important in terms of sort of who is rubbishing some of these arguments. And I sometimes think that people from this part of the world can sometimes do a better job of doing that than us. I think the Prime Minister here in Estonia has just done a fantastic job over the last few months across nearly all of the world's media in making undermining some of these stupid arguments and setting out really clearly why we're supporting Ukraine and undermining some of these Russian arguments. And I think she does that very powerfully, talking about her family history and the history of Estonia in the past. And I think people like the Prime Minister here and others are able to do that in a way that's much more compelling than maybe someone from the UK, where we don't quite have the same sort of history to recount. But and also thank you to you for undermining, combating some of these sort of ridiculous claims. You've been doing sterling work, so thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, one of my points is that Russia has a centuries-long history of having imperialist ambitions, and this idea that Russia needs to have a sphere of influence, it's not something created by NATO. It's quite ridiculous to say that Russia has started to want to have a sphere of influence now because NATO is enlarging. No, it always wanted to have a sphere of influence, and then it gets mad when it cannot have it anymore. But of course this argument has had very practical implications. 2008 NATO summit, which decided on Ukraine and Georgia potential accession to NATO, and ended with this kind of decision that was neither, how do you say it in English, ei liha ega kala. So,
neither fish nor fowl.
Yeah, that they may join, yeah, they will join one day, but they don't get a membership action plan, and so probably Russia read it as a sign that NATO is not serious about enlarging to Ukraine. Has this changed now, the question of Ukraine one day possibly joining NATO? Has the war changed it?
Well, yes, we had a summit in 2008. We also had a summit in 2021. Enlargement was on the agenda of both of those summits. The 2021 summit ended with a NATO consensus decision, which is harder to reach now because NATO has already enlarged between 2008 and 2021. So for all those, fancy social scientists out there, the variables, I mean, it's even harder this time around, right? Yet this time around there was consensus. Yes, we will enlarge NATO. So it's not the enlargement that is at question, is it? And this is basic stuff. Had nothing to do with the question of enlargement. The question was about where to enlarge. Finland and Sweden, yes. 2008, in the context of Georgia and Ukraine, there was a compromise wording, and the compromise wording is something that we stand by. I think we repeated the wording in 2021 at this summit, the Bucharest wording. But it did not clearly lead to a NATO membership yet, because NATO's policy is the same. The door remains open. I don't know when it will actually happen. Frankly, I don't know. I have a hunch on when the Finnish and Swedish ratifications processes are going to be over. I hope it's going to be very, very soon. I think it's going to be relatively soon. But nobody can know it for sure. So clearly we cannot know it about Ukraine. But it's very important to underline this, as was the case during our process towards NATO. We have agency here. We have agency. We get to decide where we want to join or not, just like Finland and Sweden. Nobody forced you in. We haven't invaded, to the best of my knowledge, taken over, you know, your decision-making processes. You make the decision. And then NATO gets to make the decision whether we want or don't want to enlarge into that particular country. Not enlargement as a philosophical concept. It's not treated as a philosophical concept anywhere but in worse panels than ours, somewhere around our think tank community. So I think these two principles were underlined at the Madrid summit this time around again. It is very important for us to maintain these principles. It's the country's decision, nobody else's. And then it's NATO's decision whether we want to open the door for that particular country or not. NATO's door, in principle, remains open.
Yeah, this issue of Ukraine and NATO is something where I would actually like to hear the views of other panelists as well. Shall we go in the...
Yeah, I'd say I agree with Jonatan, and I would just add, we can help, because the reason we can help is we can arm Ukraine, help Ukraine win, help Ukraine have secure borders, equip it with NATO standard equipment and lots of training, and also an element of make them do their homework. If you want to join, you have to do the necessary homework and, you know, meet the criteria, and then absolutely support the open door. But we can help. We're not going to make anyone join, but if they want to, we can really strongly assist them in that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the question is, what would the country themselves want to do? And I think one of the main issues also in Sweden was that we know about this open door policy. That was one of the things. And it's up to each country for themselves to decide. Then how long the process and what's the obstacles, if there are obstacles. That's from every country, but I think at least the open door policy is one of the key things.
Kusti, do you expect Ukraine to join NATO one day?
I think currently for Ukrainians it's a very abstract question. And the main selling argument of NATO is peace, averting war. That is what is NATO's business. It has been very successful in this in the last 70 or whatever years. And at the same time, there is the bloodiest war ongoing in Ukraine in 70 years. So I think they have much larger problems to overcome in Ukraine now than whether we're going to get legally membered in NATO while we are at war with Russia or not.
Thank you. I also, in my answer, would like to perhaps go back to the previous question slightly as well. Because when thinking about these false narratives about NATO enlargement and so on, there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what one is talking about when you talk about the agency of different countries. It's not only the agency of countries, again, as abstract entities. It needs to have the popular support of the people of that country. And it seems to me that there's you mentioned earlier that we could talk about emotions in some of these debates. So my first reaction to see some of these false narratives is actually anger, in the sense of belittling the will of the Finnish populace, for instance, in the process that we underwent in the winter and the spring, in terms of then wanting to seek NATO membership. And I'm wondering whether then on the other side there isn't a little bit of the sense of being scared of this idea of democracy, and this idea of free-willing people deciding on their own fate also in security policy. In terms of your question about Ukraine accession, I think I will revert to my more experienced colleagues on that matter, but I believe these 2 points about who is actually making the decision and where that agency lies are very key also in that regard.
Sure, yes. Now we have some more time for questions from the audience. I saw, again, several hands up. The one who has the mic, you can start. Just start speaking.
Okay, hello, I'm Arp, thank you, and I'm an Estonian high school student. So we have already mentioned that the addition of Sweden and Finland into NATO does not really improve us by military strength. But I was wondering, could we transport high or technologically advanced surveillance and reconnaissance technologies, like from US or France or the UK, into those countries, and therefore gain any superiority by that. And additionally, Russia currently has the largest submarine fleet in the world. And can we also neglect that by using like American anti-submarine detection technologies, so we could like lessen the Russian superiority on the Baltic Sea and also in the Atlantic Ocean? Thank you.
Very sophisticated question. Let's collect a few questions. There were more hands up.
Hi, I'm Eero Sild, an intern at the ICDS. I would like to ask a question, since thank God we don't have any Americans here today, regarding the future of European, at least in the panel, about European strategic sovereignty, or the French concept, and whether it's realistic at all, since it seems clear that the US in the long term at least would at some point like to leave Europe. And at the same time, it also seems pretty clear that the Europeans so far have not managed their strategic interests very well. I think it's very evident from Germany and some other countries. And it also seems that the Russians, for example, still see the US as NATO, and when they talk of NATO, they principally talk of the US. So in your view, is that changing? And at what point will we have a sort of strategically independent and truly, strong Europe? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. That kind of question was also on my list about the US and this discussion on European strategic sovereignty or autonomy. So we have the two questions now. Who would like to start?
Well, I can try to take the first one. The second one is too complicated. Well, clearly, we, as NATO, we don't really have any technological sort of advantage problem vis-a-vis Russia. There has been a lot of talks about cybers and AIs and everything taking over the battlefield in the last years, but what's actually going on is technologies that were developed in 20s that are, waging the war currently. So clearly it isn't an issue of how do we employ the more high tech. The issues that we have is rather more strategical and, getting our deterrence posture into the position where Russians won't even have a thought of invading NATO, because they know that the potential, whatever they, hope to gain, will be infinitely less that they will immediately lose. Yeah, but now if someone can talk about this Europe thing.
Maybe a Swedish view on the technology question, since you actually are a defense guy. So.
Yeah, perhaps then more focused on of course, the Baltic Sea region, perhaps. And I think the technical advantage is, I don't think there's such a big difference. I know all the NATO countries and Sweden and Finland around the Baltic Sea area, I think we have quite a good technology of, as you talked about, surveillance and to actually have a capability to know where they are and outnumber them. I think from that perspective, I don't see a bigger problem. I'm not really the guy to talk about what's happening in the big world, let's say fully NATO, because I'm not there yet. But in the smaller context inside the Baltic Sea region, I think there's more to it.
Sweden also has its submarines.
Yes, I think we have 4 now, and I think we're working on 2 extra. So I think that will be at least beneficial in the Baltic Sea. So.
Jonatan, you have the urge to answer to the second one.
No, I was just going to say we have one submarine, but it's in the museum in Tallinn. It's British. Well, we bought it from you, and then it became ours. It was a very good submarine, but it didn't do us much good during the 50-year occupation, frankly. So it's not always about technology. It was pretty cutting edge back then, I think, as well. Now it's in the museum. Look, on the strategic autonomy stuff, it depends really on what you mean by it. It's a vague enough concept for different people talking about this, having different ideas as to what it actually means. So if by this we are talking about strengthening Europe, and by Europe, by the way, most people who talk about this don't mean just Europe, they mean the European Union. And now having the British ambassador sitting next to me here, I mean, I need to remind people that there are other important players in Europe than just European Union member states. Certainly when it comes to security policy. But let's, talk about the European Union. A stronger European Union is in Estonia's interests. We need no convincing of this. We live on the border of the European Union. We know. We can be the lecturer. We need to strengthen European Union industrially. We need to strengthen the European Union economically. We certainly need to strengthen the European Union in the security policy domain. That's why we're advocating, and always have been advocating, for substantive common foreign and security policy, first and foremost in our neighborhood. Because if we're not taken seriously in the neighborhood, we are certainly not going to be taken seriously in the world. In many cases, though, I suspect people, when talking about strategic autonomy, mean about autonomy in strategic terms from the United States. If this is what they mean, then we would be opposed for two reasons. First, we believe it to be an unwise policy course for us as Europeans, because we believe that the 21st century, at the end of the day, in security policy terms, is going to be a major competition between fundamentally different and competing systems of governance. The worldview that we hold dear, the types of societies that we're trying to defend, are different in margins, even amongst European Union member states, but at the end of the day, we're the same democratic world with the United States. The United States, the United Kingdom, the European Union, we stand for the same things. And for us to survive and succeed in this century, of which the war in Ukraine is the first opening, really, salvo, we are to consolidate democracy at home and internationally, not divide ourselves into subgroupings and then compete with each other in the Indo-Pacific or somewhere else. That's why we don't think it to be a wise choice, a wise and good policy choice for Europe. The second reason why we would oppose it, and have always opposed it, is because it's not doable. It's not doable. One can give a good speech on this. But when it comes to the most strategic of domains or areas in security policy, which is the military defense of European territory, we can only succeed through NATO, through the alliance relationships we have with the United Kingdom and the United States, with the troops that we have here from the United Kingdom and the backing of the American military behind it. Now, mostly people discuss these concepts in think tanks, less so in governments, although I do admit that some of it, there was a spillover effect, and some of these discussions were taking place amongst the government circles. But I cannot think of a single time we've had these discussions in the European Union or just bilaterally with key European Union member states since February 24th. Because real world has now arrived. We're dealing with the actual stuff. I mean, we're giving speeches about this, but we need to deliver substance. And on this it is clear. When it comes to, again, military defense of Europe or providing military assistance to Ukraine, I mean, we're Europeans, we're pretty capable, but the challenges are pretty big as well. Can't do it without the United States. And frankly, the 21st century is going to be such that, in my personal opinion, the United States can't do it without us Europeans. So why divorce now? Why?
We have time for one final question from the audience. If anyone still wants to use the opportunity. Yes.
Does it work? Okay. Well, thank you very much, all of you, for being here today. My name is Jonas. My question might be a bit populistic, but or a bit simplified. But do you think that the larger countries within Europe, France, Germany, Italy, Spain perhaps, are pulling their weight when it comes to NATO defense of, well, yeah, of allied territory, especially in Eastern Europe, but also in support of Ukraine?
A comfortable question for a diplomat to answer, right? Who wants to start?
Might regret this. No, I'll have a go. I think, first of all, if you're a good diplomat, you don't ever be rude about your allies, particularly in public. You can have frank discussions with them in private, but you don't go, it's not sensible in life to go around being critical. But actually, I think if you look, some of the countries you've described and lots of other countries in Europe have moved an incredibly long way from where they maybe were 6 months or a year ago in terms of what they're doing, and even sometimes week by week changing their approach and doing things. So at times we might have wanted other countries to have done things a bit faster, or with fewer caveats and restrictions attached and so on. But you have to look at the direction in which they're going and what they've actually sort of done. Lots of allies in Europe are now committed to spending a lot more in defence than they were. That's really welcome. I think the era when there were only a handful of countries spending 2% is over. I think lots of the majority will do 2%, 2.5%, 3%. We'll see what happens in terms of defence spending. And I think, lots of our allies have moved in a very positive direction. And I just think it's much better to focus on, the positive things they're doing and keep encouraging them, and not, even if it's tempting, start being critical and saying, can you do more? Because sometimes the boot's on the other foot, and it's us that's delaying something, or we're seen as blocking something. And we would much rather people raise things with us in private as well. And overall, I think, echoing what Jonatan said, I think the European response in the current crisis has overall been very good. We shouldn't pat ourselves on the back too much, but the response has been quite strong, and we can be quite proud of what we've done together. We just need to keep going, do more of it, do it faster.
And just very briefly, just a statement of fact. If I'm not mistaken, Kusti, it is the German Air Force that is currently conducting Baltic air policing from Ämari Air Base. Just a fact.
Thank you. Well, our time is up, and I think this was a very good point to end with, that actually the European response to Russia's war against Ukraine has been stronger than probably many of us would have expected. It doesn't mean we can just be happy and relax. Of course, we need to constantly work hard to make sure that Ukraine gets more support, and that we do even more for our own defense in this region. But I think we managed to point to quite a few positive dynamics actually in this panel, in spite of this very serious and very bad security situation overall in Europe. So thank you all for coming. Thank you very much to the panelists, and let's enjoy the evening from now on.